So, welcome. My name is Jens Ahl and I'm Deputy Director of the Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation. I'm so pleased to see so many that come here today, although the semester haven't really started properly yet, at least not for some of us. I would like to introduce Nigel Ashford, who will say more about himself, who's going to speak today about human rights, who is one of the essential chapters of this book, Principles for a Free Society, which Nigel has written for us to use as a study guide, and I think you're going to say more about that as well. So let's start.
All right,
please.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. So my name is Nigel Ashford. My title is Senior Program Officer of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. Although I hope you'll hear that I'm in fact not American, that I'm British. I'm very keen to keep my English accent as long as possible because Americans think you're smarter than you really are. The Institute for Humane Studies, we're a classical liberal education organisation. We run lots of programs for students and young people, and if you're interested, pick up my card and go and visit our website. So my connection with this and with the Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation is that when the foundation was created to try and promote market economy and democracy in countries in transition, they asked me to write a short book to use for political education in those days in Central and Eastern Europe, post-communist countries. And since then, they've done, actually I don't know how many seminars you've done. We don't know, lots of them, lots and lots of them. I'm not an economist, so I can use words like that, I don't need a number. Lots of seminars, and I'm involved with 3 of them, usually every year here in Sweden, and that's the reason I'm here. I'm doing 2 seminars next few days in Nynäshamn with young people from the Balkans and young people from the Caucasus. So I think, although I'm not absolutely sure, I think I've been in Sweden 42 times involved in these various sorts of programs. And if you want to have a look at the book, there are copies of the book at the back, both in English and in Swedish. And shall I do a plug for people who might want to attend? Yeah. So just to say that in these seminars we have people from different countries, and one of those countries is Sweden. And so if you're interested, if you find, for example, the sort of thing we're going to discuss today is interest to you, and you're a student and or a young person, and you're interested in this, you can go to the Jarl Hjalmarson website and apply to go to one of our seminars in the future. All right? Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that. So the topic I'm going to talk about is human rights, what they are and what they are not. So in the book, I have like these 12 principles that I think are important for any form of free society, and one of them is human rights. Now, human rights is what philosophers would call a hurrah word. That means that when you hear it, you assume human rights is a good thing. It is a positive word. And there are some words, like dictatorship, which philosophers would call a boo word. That is negative. When you hear the word dictator, you know that it means a bad thing. Well, human rights is a classic case of an hurrah word. It's so positive, everybody's in favour of it. And one of the problems with that is because it's such a positive word, many people want to claim that are things that are human rights that they want to claim are human rights. In my view, they are not human rights. That we have a problem of rights inflation. Just as with money, if you print too much of it, it devalues the currency that already exists. The problem, I think, with human rights is if everything becomes a human right, then it loses its value. And so that's sort of the theme that I want to pursue. And I want to do it in several parts. So the first thing I want to do is to define what I think human rights are and give some criteria to determine whether something is a human right and whether it's not. I'm going to do a very short historical study about how we've got to where we are. And most of my time I'm going to spend looking at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, because that's normally seen as the classic definition of what human rights are. And I'm going to argue that some of the UN Declaration of Human Rights are about human rights, that some of them are about mechanisms or means to protect human rights, and that some things in the UN Declaration are not human rights at all. That's what I'm going to mainly focus on. And then at the end we'll have time for questions, and I'm perfectly happy to take questions, but it actually might be more interesting for the discussion for you to say what you think about human rights. And we can discuss any aspect of it that you want, but here's a couple of suggestions that you might want to talk about. So one question would be, how do you decide whether this is a human right and this is not a human right? What's the criteria you would use to distinguish between something which is a real human right and something which is merely desirable? Second thing you might want to think about, do you think that Sweden fully protects human rights? For example, in the area of freedom of speech. Third question you might want to talk about is, what should Sweden do about the betrayal of human rights in other countries? So, for example, what's happening in Syria, the massacres we're seeing in Syria, or what about the oppression of gay rights in Russia? What should Swedes do in those circumstances about the denial of human rights abroad? So just a couple of suggestions. You don't have to discuss those things, but you can if you wish. So let's begin with, what are human rights? And I define them as, human rights are moral rights that belong to every human being. So that means there's two essential points in that definition. The first of all, that they are moral rights. They're rights that people have, which may or may not be legal rights. They may be respected in the law or protected, recognized in the law, but historically they haven't been. Most countries have not recognized these moral rights, but they should be respected by everyone, these moral rights that we have. And we should criticize anybody who doesn't respect those moral rights. And the second part of the definition is that they belong to every human being. So that means they belong to every human being, regardless of nationality or religion or gender or politics or sexual orientation. Every single person has these rights. So again, different from citizen rights. So somebody within a society, they might have certain legal rights because they're citizens of Sweden, but that does not apply to every single person in the world. So these are rights that belong to every human being wherever they may live. So that's the definition. You may have a different one. What's my criteria for saying this is a human right? And I want to suggest 3 criteria. The first one is that it is universal. That is, it belongs to every single human being, both who live today, wherever they are in the world, but also every human being that has ever existed in the past, every human being that exists in the present, and every human being that will exist in the future. By definition, that must be true. If they have belonged to every single human being, that includes people who are not living today in that definition. So that's the first thing, universal. And normally when people think about that, they're only thinking about the people who live today. And I'm adding this extra thing, which I think is logical. It also includes human beings in the past and in the future. Second criteria is that they are absolute. Philosophers often describe them as a trump card. So when there's a dispute about something, can we afford it? People will say, no, human rights are so important, they trump any other factor. We can't deny these human rights to people, for example, because they cost too much, or because they're in clash with some other public policy agenda. So they're absolute. They override other considerations. And the third criteria, which I should say is different than in the book, in case you may notice that when you read the book, my third criteria is that they cannot be in conflict with one another. So if human rights are supposed to trump any other consideration, then what happens, then it would be impossible to find any way of reconciling human rights that might actually be in conflict with each other. So that's my criteria for deciding whether something is a human right or not. Again, you may have different criteria. Now let me briefly give a little bit of historical background, because I think it helps us to understand where we are today. But historically, human rights have been called natural rights, arising from the nature of human beings, the nature of man. So we've seen this expressed, for example, in the American Declaration of Independence, where it says every person is born with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And even the French got it right, once upon a time, in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, where you see very similarities with the sorts of claims that were made in the American Declaration. And then in the 20th century, we saw, I think, three important changes. First of all, the language of natural rights was replaced with the language of human rights. And I think the explanation for that is that natural rights tends to have a more religious flavour to it, and human rights tends to have a more secular flavour to it. The second big change was to try and incorporate human rights and turn them into legal rights, rights that citizens could use against their government, for example, which I said historically has not been true. And the third big change was the attempt to try and establish these human rights in an international document, international recognition of these human rights, which we could then use to examine every society in the world to see whether we think it met those criteria. The most important example of that is the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which I'm going to argue is mostly good, but not all. And there's been lots of other sorts of documents. The Council of Europe has a European Convention of Human Rights, which is pretty much nearly always good. And then the European Union has its own Charter of Rights, which is sort of half good, half bad. I'm going to focus on the UN one because it's the one that's most popularly used. So what are human rights? Let's try and get now specific parts of it. Again, looking at the sorts of things that we see represented in the UN Declaration. So the first are what I call liberty rights. In my view, the only true human rights. So they involve life, I should say, liberty and property. Unfortunately, philosophers often call those negative rights. And negative is usually a boo word, whereas I want to claim these negative rights are hurrah words. But philosophers, they sometimes screw things up. So the advantage of these sort of liberty rights is that they don't require anybody to do anything. All they require is that you don't interfere with other people. So it's relatively easy for people to be able to stand back and just leave it and show respect for others. Everyone has these right to be respected, have these human rights to be respected, and in turn, they have an obligation to respect the human rights of others. But all that means is you don't invade the human rights of other people. So let's get a little bit more specific, and again, pick it out from the UN Declaration. So people have a right to life, which in the UN Declaration means the right not to be killed, to be tortured, or to be abused. So there's a clear idea you should be able to go about your business without having violence being used against you. Then there's a right to liberty, which is the freedom to do as you wish, as long as you do not impinge on the freedom of others. This is sometimes the term is used, the harm principle, coming from John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher, that you can do whatever you like as long as you're not harming another person. Now, it's impossible, if you're free to do whatever you want to do, it's impossible to list all the freedoms that you have, because they're endless. You can do whatever you like, I said, unless you are harming another. But the UN Declaration has identified certain freedoms which they think are particularly important. So they talk about freedom of movement. So does that mean that we should have open borders, that we should do away with borders completely so that people can freely move wherever they want to in the world, which I would argue would be one of the most liberating factors in the reducing the amount of poverty in the world. So if there's freedom of movement, does that imply open borders? The UN talks about the freedom to marry and raise a family, and I would argue that implies as well then that gays should have the right to marry, gays should have the right to adopt. If these are rights that are universal in nature, then they can't only be restricted to one form of sexuality. The UN talks about freedom of thought and religion. So should there be any restrictions on people's expression of their religiosity? So for example, in France, they ban Islamic women from wearing the burqa. Is that a denial of their religious expression? There should be freedom of expression to be able to say whatever you want. But in many countries in the European Union, for example, it's illegal to say something racist. You can end up in jail for saying it. In many countries in the European Union, it is illegal to deny that the Holocaust happened, that 6 million Jews were exterminated in the Holocaust. Now, I think the factual evidence is overwhelmingly clear that the Holocaust happened. Should we therefore make it illegal for people to say something that we know to be untrue? I would argue, if you believe in freedom of expression, you should allow people to say these things which are untrue, and it's the responsibility of other people to say, this is untrue, this is not correct, the Holocaust really did happen. There should be no restriction on the freedom to say these things. And another liberty freedom that the UN talks about is a right of assembly, that you should have the right to organise and present your ideas like a demonstration wherever you want to. But I'm sure it's true in Sweden, as it's true as in most countries, that in order to demonstrate, you have to get a permit from the local authority to do so. Is that a restriction? And they can deny that permit. Is that restriction of your freedom of assembly one of your human rights? So that's the second group, the right to freedom, to be able to do whatever you want. And I said the UN identifies some specific ones, but it's not limited or should not be limited to those. A third UN principle, which are a liberty right, is the right to property. And it's what I call the forgotten human right. It's in there in the UN Declaration, and yet the UN never talks about it. And whenever we talk about private property and infringements on private property, how often do you hear the word human right in that context? So one of the things I hope we would do is become more conscious of that property itself is a human right. So as I said, so these parts of it in the UN Declaration, these are, I think, genuine human rights that we might want to call liberty rights. I then go on to argue that most of what's in the UN Declaration is not human rights themselves, but they're mechanisms or means of protecting human rights. And unfortunately, the UN doesn't make the distinction between these are the real human rights and these are systems or mechanisms designed to protect human rights. So there's a long list of them. You can find them in the book if you want to. The right to legal recognition, no arbitrary arrest and detention, remedies if your rights are abused, a fair trial, the presumption of innocence, you're innocent until proven guilty, a right of asylum, and a right of nationality. Now, I think all these things are highly desirable because they're means of protecting human rights, but I don't believe they are in themselves human rights. Lawyers sometimes describe them as principles of natural justice. Then we come to a third block in the UN Declaration, and these are social and economic rights, often associated with the language of social justice. Well, what happened was originally, the original document of the UN Declaration only had 20 articles, and they were good ones. But they were worried that the communist world, led by the Soviet Union, would not sign up to this UN Declaration. They wanted to have as much broad support for it as possible. So the founders of the United Nations added an extra 9, are we right? An extra 9, I think, yeah, amendments designed to encourage the communists to sign up to that document. But they did not. So they were suddenly, the West was suddenly faced with all these extra things that we didn't think were human rights, but we've ended up putting them in purely for political reasons. It failed to achieve its political goal. And again, there's a long list of these social and economic rights in Articles 21 to 30. They include the right to rest and leisure, including periodic, that is regular, holidays with pay, a right to social security, that is a form of pension for when you're old, a right to work, a right to, quote, just and fair working conditions, equal pay for equal work, fair remuneration, that is fair pay for the work that you do, an adequate standard of living, adequate housing and medical care, a right to education, and a right to enjoy the arts. Now, all these things may be desirable, but I do not believe that they are human rights. Two of the big problems with all these rights is, first of all, who is to pay for them? With human rights, with liberty rights, it's very clear. Everybody has them. Everybody has to respect them. But with these social and economic rights, who has the right to obtain them and who has the obligation to provide them? Who has the obligation to pay for them? And then the second big problem is who decides what is fair pay? Who decides what is equal pay? Who decides what is an adequate standard of living? Who is going to have the power to decide those things. And perhaps most important from my argument here is that these economic rights fail to achieve the goal, the criteria that I started at the start. So they're not universal in nature. They can't apply to every single human being today. For example, people who are self-employed, they can't be entitled to holidays with pay. But also, remember, I said that these rights, human rights, must apply to people in the past. What does it mean? What do these things mean for somebody who was like a Neolithic man? How are these rights supposed to apply to that person? They're not absolute, because very often these rights conflict with one another. So the ability, for example, to provide healthcare may be dependent on a certain a level of prosperity or wealth within a society. So does that mean it varies depending on how wealthy a society is or not? It cannot be absolute in nature. And very often these rights are in conflict with one another. So for example, you have a right to medical care, but a doctor has a right to rest and leisure. If you need that doctor's health care to give you health care, do you have a right to take away that person's human right to rest and leisure because you need the health care? These things will often be in conflict with one another. And of course it also ignores the problem of trade-offs. The more money you spend on, say, healthcare, the less money you have on education. And yet both these things are supposed to be human rights. So I don't agree with those. Then it gets worse, I'm sorry to say, is the UN Declaration, UN not satisfied with what it's already done, it then has created a whole series of other sorts of documents, other sorts of UN conventions, and they've added things like the right to self-determination, the right to decide where you want to, in what country you want to live, a right to natural wealth and resources. All peoples, and notice the plural, have a right to be equal. And what's distinctive about these sorts of new rights is that they are collective rights. The whole point about human rights is that they belong to every individual human being. But these sorts of rights that the UN has established don't belong to individual human beings, they belong to collectivities, to groups. And then, so I don't think that they actually meet the criteria for doing that. So they're not universal in nature. They only belong to certain sorts of groups and not others. So for example, one distinction I would make is I don't believe there's such a thing as human rights for gays. I think there's a question of human rights should be applied to gays as every other group in society, but there's not a distinctive set of rights that belong to gay people. Or, perhaps more provocatively, is I don't believe that there's such a thing as human rights with regard to women. I think what you can say is that women have been denied certain human rights. But by definition, if they're human rights, they must apply to men and to women. So the problem is the lack of application there has been. They're clearly not absolute. So we have this right of self-determination that you can decide in what country you want to live. But what do you do when you have in the same territory people who want to belong to different countries? So take Northern Ireland, for example, where the majority of people in Northern Ireland want to belong to the United Kingdom. A minority of people in the Northern Ireland want to belong to the Republic of Ireland. According to the UN, they both have the right of self-determination. How can you resolve that sort of conflict? They both can't get what they consider to be a right. And then finally, I said, you get these conflicts that people can, for example, change their identity. They may belong to one group in society and then want to decide to belong to another group. So I argue that many of these new rights, the UN Declaration, are the language of special rights. They're not the language of human rights. So to conclude, I think human rights are extremely important, but I think increasingly they are abused, particularly abused by people on the left. Everything that is desirable is not a human right. That when you do have the human rights, then you also have to recognize that cultures are very different, so the protection of those human rights may vary from one culture to another. And I think it's obscene when the UN equates as the equivalent torturing, putting electric shocks through somebody's genitals is somehow the equivalent of somebody who've only got 1 week of pay for their holidays. Those things are not the same. And the more we talk about the latter, the less attention we're given to the true denial of human rights, and that is things like life, liberty, and property. Thanks very much for listening.